Hi, my name is Navin Kikabai, sole author of How Educational Systems Respond to Diversity, Inclusion and Social Justice. Discipline, Power, Territoriality and Deterritorialization. The academic article is published with the British Journal of Sociology, Volume 73, Issue number 4, pages number 685 to 698. Abstract. This paper presents a critical examination of a vexed issue relating to how educational systems respond to diversity, inclusion and social justice. Whilst there are unique factors specific to the various educational sectors, that is to early years, schools, colleges, higher education and to the lifelong learning sector, this paper explores education and diversity in its broadest sense and recognises that issues are as much cross-sector as they are within sector. Further still, this paper shifts across disciplinary epistemic boundaries, making use of Foucault's tools and the work of Deleuze and Guattari. Given this broader context, this paper primarily traverses the borders of schooling and higher education. It utilises the notion of scales of justice and draws upon the work of Fraser and explores how this can offer insights into issues not only in relation to redistribution and recognition, but also to representation. It intentionally draws upon critical disability studies literature and the often forgotten discrimination known as disability. It acknowledges the various paradigms and terminological descriptors associated with disabled people, how these are intentionally, I argue, produced and reproduced, subject to a process of misframing, misrecognition and maldistribution through various territorialized and often segregated educational spaces. In response, this paper offers a reading of disability which moves through theoretical and conceptual understandings and advances the notion of deterritorialization in order to escape, engage and identify larger patterns of inequality. It offers different insights, provides an alternative mapping that can raise different critical questions about disability, also to issues of diversity, inclusion and social justice. Introduction. Whilst there are unique factors specific to the various educational sectors, that is to early years, schools, further education, colleges, higher education and to the lifelong learning sector, this paper explores education and diversity in its broadest sense and recognises that issues are as much cross-sector as they are within sector. And in some instances, this also extends to the workplace. After all, as Peters noted, from a global perspective, disabled people face injustice and discrimination regardless of national boundaries, whether these are global or within education itself. Certainly, ending barriers experienced by disabled people is as much about making transparent territorialized boundaries between sectors as well as within sectors and across disciplinary fields. Indeed, as Pasai noted, boundaries are one part of the discursive landscape of social power, which is decisive in social control and the maintenance of social order. As is noted by Vallard, territory matters, and that this also involves scrutiny of political institutions, social practices, representations, ideologies, images, discourses and symbols by which territorial demarcations are established, consolidated and maintained. For sure, surveying territories of knowledges which often shape understandings of equality, social justice and by association notions of diversity and social mobility also matters. In unison to this and within the context of higher education, this includes notions of widening participation. For example, Ray, with respect to social class and borrowing from Stephen Ball, made this point. There is only so much that educational institutions can do to improve social class inequalities given the economic and social context in which they operate. As Ball concludes, schools are increasingly the wrong place to look if we want to do something about class inequalities in education. For clarity, Ball suggests looking at the commodification of the social through a plethora of educational services fueled by lucrative, aggressive market forces which instill fear and insecurity in parents' sensibilities, caught across boundaries focusing on relational advantage and little, if any, consideration to the fate of others. Of course, this middle-class relational advantage is out of reach for many disabled and non-disabled parents of disabled children, even though there are policy claims giving such parents personal budgets and so-called choice. It may also be equally useful to look elsewhere. In another domain, UK higher education has been marked by an agenda of widening participation and has primarily been monitored in relation to socio-economic status, age, gender, religion, ethnicity, sexuality, and less so disability. Interestingly, it took a second edition of Fractured Identities, first published in 1996, to acknowledge disability, albeit only a briefer look. Whilst such groups have generally increased their higher education participation rates, these have tended to be measured on single identity characteristics. Such approaches to recognition involve arguably what Fraser notes as being a practical recognition effect, a stigmatising result of its official recognition comment. As will become apparent and argued elsewhere, the study of disability is a commitment to normalcy. Moreover, in terms of access to higher education, focus has generally been on individuals having to reach what is considered the gold standard, a so-called measure of student success, an illusion of meritocratic opportunity, a so-called royal road, and access through attaining A-level results. According to Lawler, who, discussing working class identity, suggests that the discourse of widening participation associated social policy is one of lack, a consistent deficit perspective. Arguably, this discourse is operationalised as a territorial modern dualistic narrative, lack as opposed to plenty. This associated policy context is laden with ableist and disablist rhetoric, coercive, perpetuating and privileging notions of ableism, normalcy, the ideal normal and the mean or default. Indeed, for Davis, normalcy and disability are part of the same system. Even more, there has, through various higher education access initiatives such as foundation degrees, outreach open days, events and programmes, been a growing focus on areas of first generation, low income, women and specific ethnic groups. Relatively little attention has been paid to mature students, part-time students, students without A-levels, disabled students, students having completed access courses, and also to a lesser extent that which questions curricula and assessment procedures. Further still, whilst Demon Morley identified a wider policy context under the then UK Labour government and features of the different forms of inequality, little attention has been directed at how higher education institutions are duty-bound to change, and requirements under legislative requirements to respond to diversity and make reasonable adjustments. As Bradley notes, the now Equality and Human Rights Commission, a single equalities body, has replaced previous equality commissions. Across other borders, there are those who discuss campus climate and advance a model for diverse learning environments, link micro, students, and macro, the institution, level contexts that are themselves subject to socio-historical forces. Others who explore academic ableism in relation to disability in higher education, offering an affirmative perspective. Others who offer a student experience practitioner model. Yet still others who advance a culturally responsive pedagogy. As such, this paper examines misframing of modern higher education participation with reference to questions about its purpose and function, social mobility, the politics of disability, the politics of higher education participation, how educational systems respond to diversity, inclusion, and social justice. Connections are made with recognising the dynamics of a social system, mechanisms of social selection, and institutional violence using a Foucauldian Deleuze-Guattarian analysis. It also highlights the use of able-bodied metaphors as an attempt to advance social theory, yet results, as will be noted, in disability erasure. It identifies discussions which shape changing terminological descriptors across territorialized spaces, raising concerns about participatory parity. It links to educational policy, legislative changes, and identifies teacher education and postgraduate courses that reveal and perpetuate a disablist cultural capital, understandings which perpetuate multiple inequalities. Finally, this paper interlinks issues of power, discipline, territoriality and deterritorialization using the work of Deleuze and Guattari to highlight boundaries of segregated provision. It deconstructs the territorial disability divide, identifying dominant and dominating paradigms. It identifies complex social orderings and addresses issues of diversity, inclusion and social justice. Addressing issues of social justice, recognition, redistribution and representation. In brief, Fraser offers a critique of a post-socialist condition in relation to three features. First, a vision of social transformation for a just social order. Second, a shift in the grammar of social justice. And third, economic liberalism. Fraser scrutinises the distinction between culture and the economy by decentering recognition and redistribution in terms of growing gross inequality and aggressive marketisation. Fraser integrates both recognition and redistribution, arguing that neither can remedy injustice alone. In a political exchange, Fraser offers a perspectival dualist analysis and argues that recognition and distribution are irreducible. Later, Fraser explores justice in relation to modern territorial states, critiquing the Westphalian frame, and offers a third dimension, principally representation. In short, Fraser advances the previous two-dimensional understanding of justice and offers a three-dimensional theory of justice. For Fraser, participatory parity evokes the political and enables the identification of misframing. Misframing modern higher education participation. Whilst there is a plethora of models related to improvement, development, quality assurance and teaching strategies approaches promoting educational participation, those that have related to disability have tended to be conceptually framed, arguably misframed, by an individual deficit medical model of disability. Indeed, there have been opponents whose work has been to repeatedly dispute such thinking and practice, and from which each is concerned with the ordinary political representation to the principle of participatory parity. Interestingly, this principle is encapsulated in the title of the edited work by Swain and French, Disability on Equal Terms, which seeks to confront injustices, disableism, experienced by disabled people and simultaneously advances in an affirmative model aligned with a broader disability arts movement, an assertion of identity politics. Although, as argued by Fraser, affirmative recognition could possibly fuel flames of resentment. Elsewhere, Ralston and Barnes have been addressing issues related to the political economy, suggesting that the territory of discussion should widen beyond simply that of access to paid work, and the need to look more creatively at the economic and social contribution made by disabled people outside of paid work. Arguably, the authors are, in Fraser's terms, deconstructing what it means to work. Anitha and Pearson, who document the experiences of striking South Asian women too, are suggesting restructuring industrial relations in favour of Fraser's analytical framework, which integrates recognition and redistribution. For Fraser, exploring injustices of recognition and redistribution have advanced political philosophical debate into reconciling the redistribution-recognition dilemma. In the context of higher education, pertinent questions are being asked in terms of its purpose, its function, who they include and exclude, principally in this case concerning the politics of disability and the politics of higher education participation and of representation. More broadly, a searching question was asked in an edited publication published in the first designated International Year of Disabled People, asking, is higher education fair? In a contributing chapter, Williamson, using a social class analysis, noted that where social mobility depends more than ever on education certification, white-collar workers, technical workers, professionals and semi-professionals are the groups which have benefited most from the expansion of higher education. Is it realistic to expect that they will settle for something less in the future? I ask this without knowing the answer, but suspecting that whatever happens to higher education in the coming few years, those who have historically had little access to it will be those less likely to be consulted about how it should change or to benefit from the changes which will take place. In Weber's terms, exploring this institutional violence involves an examination of rationality, the bureaucratic apparatus and distribution of power. And in Marx's terms, this involves exploring the experience of alienation alongside material relations, commodification and capitalist modes of academic production. This no doubt raises a question of representation and if, indeed, whether higher education has a future at all. And it seems this is irrespective of whether it is considered as being fair. Rather, given a post-COVID-19 future, the university machine has jammed and instead is scrambling for new online and virtual territorialised spaces. For sure, Dolmage, in the context of recognising and acknowledging the injustice against disabled people, cautions against retrofit approaches, and in the context of this impeding restructuring suggests that change is framed as deformation and a transgression of not only space but time, arguing that the retrofit, an afterthought rather than being central to the restructuring process, is typically additional to or to fix later in some way. Certainly, within the US context, the question relating to the purpose of higher education has been earlier addressed by Ryan and Sacre, who collated essays of personal reflections and perspectives of working class academic staff who discuss working within an insane system and relate to notions of escape. Moreover, the authors maintain that whilst there is a definite allure to higher education participation, one of its primary functions is to mask the myth of upward social mobility, noted to be a grand lie, and not just for students. Incidentally, Hooks also made the point that the academy is not paradise and likened it to a prison, a place of punishment and confinement rather than a place of promise and possibility. Dare it be stated, a sobering thought, that when the Khmer Rouge took political control of Cambodia, they converted schools into prisons. No doubt their similarities are uncanny. Similarly, exploring the experience of working class students in elite universities, Ray and others also explored the issue of higher education participation and inquired as to whether such students are likewise strangers in paradise. They reported that their experiences tend to be marked by chance events, a clueless serendipity. Their trajectories were facilitated by often the support of one individual teacher. And although none of the participants thought they were strangers, they did think that higher education participation was not paradise. Critically and admittedly, at least for Ryan and Sacre, neither of the studies involved the representation of ethnically diverse participants, nor disabled people as part of their investigations. Although arguably there is a common thread. For example, When Ryan and Sacre asked whether participants would repeat the choices they made, specifically in relation to working within the academy, the majority said no, which resonated with Amy's response as a student in Ray and others' study, who disclosed that I wouldn't recommend it to anyone else particularly. A further interest in Ray's study is reference to Young, whose satirical sociological essay concerning meritocracy reflects back from the year 2034 and wrote, the educational ladder was also a social ladder, as well as morphing from the bottom requires a new accent. Correspondingly, Warriku discovered in her project, which also relates to the conception of meritocracy and of race, found that not only does accent mean a lot, but that within the British context, elite higher education is complicit in reproducing that inequality, in part through admission systems. Although reading comments from students at Oxford, there is little speaking up about racism, class bias, or crossing any other hurt line. Apparently, such discriminations are passed off as jokes. The idea that social mobility involves working class students acquiring an accent is also found across educational boundaries. For example, Crozier and others, focusing on access, participation and diversity, questions in relation to post-compulsory further and higher education noted that working class students found themselves being forced in acts of reinvention, and there was evidence of the need to change an accent. More broadly, David, with additional contributing authors, noted that whilst there has been an increase in participation in higher education in the 21st century, policies have not led to fair or equal access to equal types of higher education. Moreover, whilst Ray further still explored the miseducation of the working classes, Ryan and Sacre much earlier argued that the promise of class mobility underlies the ideological justification for inequalities within capitalism, and alternately offers the basic characteristics of the dynamics of the social system and the place of the academy in the order of things. Put succinctly, the order of things, not only the order of discourse, is primarily about how the academy is part of the problem, a contradiction of democracy, and is an arbiter that produces and reproduces inequality, competition and so-called academic rank, points that are ignored by Ray and others. Moreover, Ray and others also raise the issue of both belonging and escape, in this instance in relation to working class connections, and yet arguably, in contrast, there is also merit in escape from modern higher education institutions, given that they have transformed, consisting of wheels within wheels, a slow-moving juggernaut and increasingly subject to market forces. Arguably, in Foucauldian terms, the issue associated with the ideological justification of social mobility is a controlled discourse, encapsulated in power knowledge that has long before been spoken. This omission is arguably a kind of Mercato projection, a distortion of territorialized spaces, actions and violent paradigmatic effects, invariably serving to exclude the already estranged. Nonetheless, Ray does later point at elite universities, which are the primary engines with elitist processes that masquerade as meritocracy, that operationalise a mechanism of social selection. Although I had earlier linked this to the economy. For sure, social mobility is a mirage, a figment of imagination brought to life in policy and political rhetoric, an optimistic fantasy. And nor is this about remaking or resetting the university as some would have it, but fundamentally about the politics of higher education participation and questions of redistribution, recognition and representation. Arguably, discussions about escape attempts being unidirectional rather than bi or multidirectional, participation in higher education and one-generational upward social mobility are as much about modern culture, recognition and an individual's search for meaning, novelty and their own true identity, and how the individual is constructed. Relatedly, in Decolonising the University, de Sousa Santos makes clear that the past 4 decades the university has been undergoing a process of paradigmatic change and has become an additional problem. In decolonisation terms, it is not the question how can the university address the role it has played in reproducing global inequalities, but rather how can the university address the role it has played and continues to play in reproducing global inequalities that should be asked. Moreover, kick by with respect to disability, the rhetoric of widening participation, and in conjunction with those labelled as having learning difficulties, a fictitious entity, are beset by multiple barriers. The impaired mind-body has become a problem, territorialised and subject to control and mistreatment. Definitions of disability being medical, biological, psychological, legal, educational, pseudoscientific and others abound. Foucault's army of technicians for sure. Such definitions or frames embody a different kind of territorialised and segregated world, in which students conform to educational norms in a coercive and aggressive higher education institutional culture. Legislative change, able-bodied metaphors and erasing disability. So be it. Of particular importance within the literature related to disability in higher education since the 1990s are the legislative changes that have affected the education and employment rights of disabled people. For example, the Disability Discrimination Act, the Special Educational Needs and Disability Act, UK government recognition of British Sign Language as a language in 2003, the Disability Equality Duty and the Equality Act, requiring public bodies to actively promote equality for disabled people, have all contributed to this changing reterritorialised educational landscape. Relatedly, Ahmed's work considers how diversity can become an institutional end and uses the idea of the higher education institution being understood as a body or machine as a metaphor. Specifically, the institution is being imagined as an organic body, is understood as a singular entity made of multiple interrelated parts, all of which contribute to the health and well-being of that body. Indeed, organic and mechanical metaphors are used simultaneously as ways of describing the institution. Both metaphors work to convey an entity that is made up of parts, where the communication between parts is essential to an overall performance. Ahmed later goes on to argue that institutional racism becomes part of the institutional language and that the institution becomes the sick person who can be helped by receiving the appropriate treatment. Without doubt, so-called normalcy and the notions of ableism are being advanced. On the contrary, and far from this metaphor working, a kind of tree logic, there are many so-called sick people who are not racist and certainly not disablist. Arguably, disabled people are made invisible. Disability, that is, its discrimination, is being erased. Unsurprisingly then, that almost 3 decades earlier, feminist research specifically focuses on social justice, identifying gaps and silences, and its calling to account for the complexity of all forces of identity formation, continues to be ignored. Incidentally, it's also ignored elsewhere. Territorialised educational spaces, more disability erasure and disablist cultural capital. In critically examining the changing terminological descriptors in which the lives of disabled people are shaped and reshaped across the various territorialised spaces and educational sectors, it is worthwhile stating that such labelling is not natural nor neutral. Indeed, as Slee noted with reference to schooling and a growing special education industry, special educational needs became an all-embracing metaphor for the defective child. In turn, the functional label of special educational needs has metaphorically become a refugee camp for the casualties of schooling. For Slee, this is part of an enduring episteme. As individuals attend compulsory schooling, there is a complex pathologising bureaucratic machine of misframing and labelling, operating by the determination of degrees of deviance. For example, Disabled young people and those labelled as having special educational needs are assumed to be one and the same, when there are disabled young people who do not have labels of SEN, and there are individuals said to have SEN who are not disabled young people, although they are often subject to the same discriminations. By inference, deconstructing this territorial disability divide also arguably acknowledges that there are individuals without impairments who are disabled. That is, there are disabled people without impairments. For those labelled as having SEN, previously said to be approximately 20% of the schooling population in the UK, of which 18% were identified as being part of the mainstream, and that between 2 and 3%, a later conceded point that this was a kind of guess, who are statemented and accompanied, or at least should be, by an educational health and care plan, are said to require special educational provision, often in the form of a segregated special or specialist school. Moreover, Warnock, in an about turn, publicly described this statement in process as a real evil, and later added that it is wasteful and bureaucratic and causes bad blood between parents and authorities. Apart from disabled people themselves being denied participatory parity as active members on the Warnock Inquiry Panel, this was also no doubt fuelled by the rise of so-called professionals. In an age of disabling professions when people have problems and so-called experts had solutions, while scientists measured imponderables such as abilities and needs. For sure, trainee teachers and university students on postgraduate courses can have special programs and special education units staffed by special educators where they are taught about human defect, who in turn become tomorrow's tutors and trainers, caught up, implicated and entangled in a different modern performative regulatory bureaucratic machine with little chance of escape, some converting and cashing in on their disablist cultural capital, a site of reaffirmation presented under the guise of rationality. Rather than challenging institutional infrastructures, segregated territorialized boundaries and educational epistemic violence, injustice. Incidentally, associated special educational essays are an open invitation to prejudice, where everything becomes a disorder, disease, disadvantage, abnormality, syndrome, suffering, defect, special, challenging, tragedy, fixated as they are on individual impairments, types of SEN, deficit and disablist ideologies, and even more so when it comes to notions of so-called learning difficulties. One can reflect, of course, on this intentional turn of events and wonder why are educational practitioners fixated on medical understandings of disability? Ought they not be studying medicine instead? Normalcy, so much for the good life and the only life worth living. Although it may be more appropriate to re-invoke the title from Clee and others' earlier work, The Good Old Days, to describe this intentional state of affairs, at least in a territorialized modern form. Borrowing from Fanon, in this territorialized educational space where the wretched of the earth exist, profiteers training and shaping colonized minds, perpetuating multiple inequalities, exerting its epistemic violence for future reproducibility, where inequality, segregation and exclusion remain the order of things, rather than pursuing epistemic justice and embracing culturally responsive pedagogy, creating accessible and enabling spaces, understanding the cultural and political struggle of excluded groups, human diversity, inclusion and social justice. Instead, this modern higher education institution, a slow-moving juggernaut, bureaucratic, engaging in a rhetoric of whining participation, being a form of violence in which all are equally powerless, a form of tyranny without a tyrant, gives rise to new modes of surveillance, control, regulation, discipline, punishment and exclusion. As is noted, educational difficulties, discriminations are deeply entrenched within English educational policy and practice, and its dominant frame is not only one of lack but also of individual deficit. Power, discipline, territoriality and deterritorialization. Given this misframing of SEN and disability, it should be no surprise that debates about the place of disabled young people within mainstream or special provision are circular and, as argued elsewhere, has an intentionally strong resistance to closure. Indeed, inherent in this contentious debate is, in Nietzschean terms, the master-slave dialectic, the deficit and exclusionary language which authors uncritically adopt and from which there is seldom any escape. With respect to the schooling sector, such provision has been restructured under a plethora of alternative and nonetheless segregated provision under a terminological and shifting deterritorial boundary with academies, free schools, academy specialist schools, alternative provision, pupil referral units, to name but a few. Whilst the discipline of international relations has been discussing the end of boundaries and the geography of education is awakening, within this educational context, new boundaries of segregated provision have emerged. Modes of exclusion are breaking down, marking new segregated spaces of spatial confrontations shaped by economic neoliberal imperatives. As such, disability is not natural nor neutral, but politically determined, forever shifting, resulting in new forms of segregation, territorialized spaces and discrimination. People's identities reflect the territorialized space, time and context in which those identities were formed. That is, identities change. And as Arendt noted, with issues of race. Equally applicable to disability, that it is not a fact of life but an ideology, and the deeds it leads to are not reflex actions but deliberate acts based on pseudo-scientific theories. Disability is ideologically constructed. Little would it have been known that for some, knowing that UK government policy related to developing inclusion is ambiguous and contradictory, that a further fragmentation of educational provision is taking shape, that is pro-segregation. At the heart of this conceptual exploration is the major issue of human existence. Certainly the lives of disabled people have been framed by dominant and dominating paradigms, often with fatal outcomes, involving power knowledge discourses of surveillance, control, regulation, discipline, punishment and exclusion. In this modern episteme, we are segmented from all around, in every direction, in a binary fashion, following the great major dualist oppositions. This has been amidst acts of resistance, challenging dualisms such as body, mind, normal, abnormal, able, disabled, symbolic to, in opposition to psycho-hierarchical structures of modernism that impaired body as breaking with repressive and modernist modes of existence constructed by power relations and hierarchically ordered by contrasting disabled identities, and offering different possibilities of resistance, symbolic too. For sure, the history of academic disciplines can be written in terms of violent paradigmatic shifts. The geopolitical map has been changing. Social divisions are deepening. Ageism, racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, xenophobia, xenoracism, disablism, ableism in the US are on the rise. Inequalities and discriminatory practice have increased, and as Fraser highlights, in abnormal times, amidst global insecurity, growing inequality, displaced and stateless individuals, rising in work poverty, food poverty, climate catastrophe, financial crisis, nationalism, rise in national and global territorial disputes, there are no problems of framing justice in a globalizing world. Given the all-subjective principle in terms of access to justice in a post-COVID-19 world, it appears that disabled people who are subjected to the policies that segregate them are at the same time denied any parity of participation in the formal political process in which to hold the decision makers to account. This, almost 4 decades later, being a prophetic articulated point made earlier by Williamson. In this sense, and in relation to higher education participation, What is its substance and frame of justice that address issues of recognition, redistribution and representation in a globalising age? Given this context, it is important to recognise the relationship between schools and universities, as Lee and Vima noted. Schooling has acted as a credentialising turnstile for higher education and the skilled and profession-based workforce. The requirements of the unskilled labour market, together with domestic family service for girls and a segregated system of special education, has colluded with schools to disguise the extent of educational failure. Absolutely, schools continue to have this role, and of course, needless to say, this is an inaccessible credentialising turnstile for higher education. Arguably, in terms of overcoming injustice, recent examination chaos in the UK and dismantling institutional and political obstacles, scrutiny also involves an investigation of professional values, those who perpetuate the use of and principally define the needs of disabled people, including those labelled as having SEN. In a recent United Nations concluding observation of the UK on the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability with regards to education, Article 24, reported that the committee is concerned at a. The persistence of a dual education system that segregates children with disabilities in special schools, including based on parental choice. B. The increasing number of children with disabilities in segregated education environments. C. The fact that the education is not equipped to respond to the requirements of high quality inclusive education, particularly reports of school authorities refusing to enrol a student with disabilities who is deemed to be disruptive of other classmates. And D. The fact that the education and training of teachers in inclusion competencies does not reflect the requirements of inclusive education. For sure, disabled people, whether children or adults, should be part of the decision-making process, participatory parity, to inform and respond to the requirements of inclusive education. Far from this, and moreover, the so-called helping and well-being professions have shifted from explicit forms of terror and punishment to more subtle forms of coercive control and self-regulation. In Fraser's terms, individuals are denied interacting with others as peers and suffer from status inequality and distributive injustice. As to the notion of needs, Haynes and Rubain noted that the emphasis should be on the language of entitlements rather than that of needs, and similarly by Morgan, who in the context of higher education noted, the support required by a student is often referred to as needs, which is a negative term and suggests that an institution is having to provide extra support to help them succeed. In fact, the support they require is an entitlement, and it is a university's duty and responsibility to provide the support required by a student to enable them to thrive and be successful in their studies. To be clear, whilst needs-based provision may be the most redistributive, they certainly compound, isolating, stigmatising the so-called needy. As noted, needs reinforce deficit and disadvantage, and taking the pseudo-medical example of emotional and behavioural difficulties induces a clinical mindset from which it is difficult to escape. As was pointed out, it ought to be borne in mind that throughout history and across cultures, the actions and practices of labelling, misframing, is determined by judgments made by others, including professionals, policymakers, organisations, institutions, researchers and receptionists. As Fraser argued, this is much more than maldistribution or misrecognition, but both. In a previous study, Val, for example, one of the case study participants, reported that whilst interviewing for a lecturing post, one of them wasn't quite sure where he was, and a member of the reception staff came up to us and said, "One of your students is lost," in a way that she wouldn't have said with someone who didn't have learning difficulties, and that's a very day-to-day domestic level, and there's a hell of a lot of learning that needs to come out. It will be about confronting their own prejudices and assumptions rather than anything else, that people with learning difficulties aren't any different than anybody else. What became apparent with the identification of the attitudinal barriers is not only the shift required from higher education, but also the assumption that individuals described as having so-called learning difficulties do not attend job interviews, and certainly not, it would seem, for a position as a lecturer. As such, these are complex political social orderings involving misrepresentation, maldistribution and misrecognition, and the converse being three fundamental dimensions of justice. Conclusion. This paper has focused on how educational systems respond to diversity, inclusion and social justice across territorialised boundaries, and how disability is often intentionally ignored, silenced and erased. Indeed, as Davis had noted much earlier in terms of the usual repeated triad of race, class and gender, disability is a missing term. This paper specifically drew upon the work of Fraser, which has provoked a different set of questions in terms of recognition, redistribution and representation. Related questions are not those that relate to lack, individual deficit, or even whether the status of disabled people is better or worse, but those that examine territorial boundaries, surveying territories of knowledges which often shape understanding of equality and social justice, from which arguably these inequalities emerge. For sure, focusing on schools alone is increasingly the wrong place to look. As has been repeatedly shown, education has been used to perpetuate a narrowly defined notion of meritocracy, only to advance the already advantaged. For sure, modern higher education is transforming, carving out new territorialised virtual spaces, increasingly subject to neoliberal market and consumerist forces. Indeed, higher education now falls under the Consumer Rights Act 2015. What has been experienced is the discourse of widening participation in relation to disabled people is one of misrecognition, maldistribution and misrepresentation through an individual deficit, needs-based, medical, colonial and pathologising bureaucratic machine. Research too often ignores, silences and erases disability as it interacts with identity characteristics. Epistemic territorialised boundaries of knowledges about disability and its associated discourses, misrepresentations, images, symbols, ideologies cut across educational sectors and, as noted, are expressions of power relations. Unashamedly, universities can be found to be engaging in conversations of diversity, inclusion, social justice and more recently decolonisation, whilst simultaneously supporting and sponsoring territorialised segregated schooling. Several studies have explored inequalities in higher education and used social mobility as a measure of success. Yet the very system of higher education is situated within a broader social political system. Higher education is part of the problem, a contradiction. Their role in reducing and challenging inequality only operationalises social selection, rendering social mobility a mirage. Indeed, as is apparent with reference to disabled people, one generational upward social mobility, schooling, higher education participation, teacher education and special educational programs carry within them examples of misrecognition, misrepresentation and maldistribution given their commitment to normalcy, dynamics of a social system and ideological justification. Social selection across territorialised boundaries, perpetuating multiple inequalities. In practice, their policy contexts are laden with ableist, disablist rhetoric, situated within a modern performative regulated bureaucratic machine and are far removed from epistemic justice or to creating accessible and enabling spaces, and even further away from a three-dimensional theory of justice as advanced by Fraser. New territorialised boundaries of segregated spaces have emerged, resulting in new forms of segregation and exclusion. Amidst these territorialised and re-territorialised spaces, different acts of resistance are challenging dominant paradigms, making transparent the order of things, at times emerging from chance events. From the margin, rhizomatic, not tree-like, and challenging complex political social orderings. Thank you.